How did repainting my late father's Ford pink lead to my daughter losing her car, her allowance, and her safety net in less than 24 hours? Why did staying calm for one night matter more than any argument I could have started in that garage? This is how I stopped being a father she could use and became the consequence she didn't expect. The airport parking lot was nearly empty at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. I'd been gone for 8 days, a consulting contract in Denver that had stretched longer than expected. My mind was already shifting into home mode as I walked toward the long-term parking section, mentally cataloging the week ahead, catch up on emails, review the quarterly reports, maybe take the Ford out for a weekend drive now that spring was finally settling in. The Ford. Dad's 1967 Mustang that had become mine after the service 3 years ago. Not just inherited, earned through 2 decades of Saturday mornings in his garage, learning the difference between a 289 and a 302, understanding why original parts mattered, discovering that restoration wasn't just about making something look new again. It was about preserving what came before. I turned the corner toward my usual parking row and stopped. Even in the dim overhead lighting, the color was unmistakable. Bright pink. Not a subtle rose or a classic salmon, the kind of aggressive, artificial pink you'd find on a child's bicycle. The paint job covered the entire car, dripping slightly around the wheel wells where whoever did this had been careless with the spray gun. For a moment, I thought I was looking at the wrong car. But there was the small dent above the rear bumper from when I'd backed into a post 5 years ago. There was the chrome I'd spent 3 weekends polishing last fall. There were the custom floor mats visible through the windows, the ones Dad had ordered in 1968 and somehow never installed. I walked around the car slowly, my carry-on bag forgotten beside the driver's door. This wasn't vandalism by strangers. The paint was too evenly applied, too deliberate. Someone had taken time with this. Someone with access to my garage, my tools, my space. Someone who knew exactly what this car meant to me. The memory hit me like cold water. Dad's hands guiding mine as I learned to sand primer smooth. Take your time, Brent. This isn't about speed. This is about doing it right. This car will outlast both of us if we treat it with respect. I pulled out my phone and called home. No answer. Called again. Still nothing. The drive home took 23 minutes. The Ford ran perfectly, of course. Whatever else had been done to it, the engine remained untouched. But every reflection in store windows, every glance in the rearview mirror reminded me that someone had decided my father's legacy was their canvas. The garage door was still open when I pulled into the driveway. The overhead fluorescent lights were on, casting harsh shadows across the workbench where I kept my restoration tools. Paint cans sat on the concrete floor, 3 empty cans of Flamingo Fantasy Pink, according to the labels. A spray gun lay beside them, still connected to my air compressor. My air compressor, my garage, my tools used to destroy my father's car. "Oh my God, you're back!" Lila appeared in the doorway between the garage and the house, still wearing paint-splattered clothes. At 22, she had her mother's ability to fill a room with dramatic energy, but none of Irene's instinct for when to deploy it strategically. "Do you love it? I thought the old color was so boring. This is much more fun, don't you think?" She was smiling. Actually smiling as if she'd done me a favor. "When did you do this?" My voice sounded calmer than I felt. "Yesterday. It took forever. Caleb helped, but he's useless with anything that requires actual skill. I had to do most of the work myself." She gestured toward the paint cans with obvious pride. "I watched like 6 YouTube videos to make sure I did it right." YouTube videos. To repaint a car that had taken my father and me 20 years to restore properly. "Why didn't you paint your own car?" I asked. The question seemed to catch her off guard. She blinked, her smile faltering slightly. "What do you mean?" "Your Civic is sitting right there." I nodded toward her white Honda, parked safely in the driveway, untouched. "If you wanted to paint a car pink, why not paint your own car?" "Because..." She paused, searching for an explanation that apparently hadn't occurred to her. "Because yours is cooler, and it was just sitting here doing nothing while you were gone. I thought you'd think it was funny." Funny. She thought erasing 2 decades of careful restoration work would be funny. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something I'd been missing for years. This wasn't rebellion. Rebellion would have been painting her own car and dealing with the consequences. This wasn't even a prank. Pranks were reversible. This was contempt, the kind of casual disrespect that comes from never having faced a real consequence, never having learned that some things are not yours to touch. "Are you mad?" she asked, and I could hear something new in her voice. Not concern, exactly. More like curiosity about whether I'd finally react the way she seemed to want me to. I walked to the workbench and began putting away the tools she'd left scattered across its surface. "It's late. I'm tired." "So you're not mad?" I didn't answer. Instead, I turned off the compressor, capped the paint cans, and began switching off the garage lights one by one. Dad? The word hung in the air between us. She'd been calling me that since she was 8 when her mother left and I decided to stay. Not because I had to. Lila wasn't my biological daughter, but because someone needed to. I hit the final light switch, leaving us in darkness except for the glow from the house. We'll talk tomorrow, I said, and walked past her into the house. But I already knew we wouldn't talk. Not the way she expected. Because in that moment, standing in my garage surrounded by the evidence of her contempt, I realized something that should have been obvious years ago. Lila had never learned to see me as someone whose boundaries mattered, and that was my fault. The kitchen was dark when I made my way downstairs at 2:17 a.m. Sleep wasn't coming, and I needed to understand how I'd gotten here, how the little girl who used to help me wash the Ford on Sunday afternoons had become someone who would destroy it without a second thought. I made coffee and sat at the table where Lila and I had eaten breakfast together for 14 years. The same table where she'd done homework while I reviewed client files, where we'd planned her high school graduation party, her college applications, her first apartment hunt that had somehow never resulted in her actually moving out. The pattern was there if I was willing to see it. When Irene left, Lila was 8 and I was 37. I'd been married to her mother for 3 years, long enough to become the only father figure Lila had ever known, but not long enough to have any legal claim to her when the marriage ended. Irene made it clear I could walk away. The divorce would be simpler. Lila would adjust, but I'd already fallen in love with being a father. Not just to any child, to this specific, bright, stubborn little girl who asked endless questions about how engines worked and why grown-ups made such complicated decisions about simple things. So I stayed, fought for joint custody, then primary custody when Irene decided motherhood was incompatible with her need to find herself in Portland. Learned to braid hair and navigate parent-teacher conferences and explain why some kids have 2 parents who live together while others have different arrangements. For the first few years, Lila was grateful, genuinely, touchingly grateful that I'd chosen her over the easier path. She'd tell people I was her real dad and get defensive if anyone suggested otherwise. She'd help me with projects around the house, eager to prove she was worth the choice I'd made. But gratitude, I learned, has a shelf life. The first signs appeared when she turned 13. Small things, rolling her eyes when I asked about homework, forgetting to do chores, testing how far she could push before I'd push back. Normal teenage behavior, everyone assured me. She's just asserting independence. Except I never pushed back. Not really. When she called me Brent instead of Dad in front of her friends, I let it slide because I understood she was trying to fit in. When she spent my credit card limit on clothes she never wore, I raised the limit instead of addressing the spending. When she got suspended for talking back to her chemistry teacher, I focused on getting her back into class rather than on why she thought disrespect was acceptable. I told myself I was choosing my battles, being the understanding parent, compensating for the mother who'd walked away. But Lila was learning something else entirely, that I would absorb any amount of disrespect rather than risk losing her. The pattern solidified in high school. She'd mock my clients at dinner parties, loud enough for them to hear. She'd invite friends over without asking, leaving messes I'd clean up without comment. She'd borrow my car and return it with an empty gas tank, laughing when I mentioned it. "You're so uptight, Dad. It's just gas. Just gas. Just mess. Just rudeness. Always just something small enough that addressing it would make me seem petty." Her senior year, she announced she was bringing her boyfriend Caleb to prom, not asking, announcing. Caleb was 19 to her 17, worked sporadically at a vape shop, and had already been arrested twice for minor involvement with illegal substances. When I tried to discuss this, Lila accused me of being controlling and threatened to go live with her mother. I backed down. Irene hadn't spoken to Lila in 6 months at that point, but the threat still worked. College was supposed to change things. Lila got into the state university an hour away. Not her first choice, but respectable. I paid tuition, room, board, books, and a generous monthly allowance. She'd gain independence, I'd reclaim my space, and we'd both grow into a healthier relationship. Instead, she dropped out after 3 semesters and moved back home. Not because she was struggling academically. Her grades were fine, because she couldn't see the point of her major and needed time to figure things out. Caleb moved in 2 weeks later. Officially, he was just staying temporarily while he looked for his own place. That was 18 months ago. Now I had 2 adults living in my house, contributing nothing to expenses, treating my home like a crash pad, and my belongings like community property. When I suggested Lila get a job, she'd remind me that she was still figuring things out and didn't want to get stuck in some no-future position. When I hinted that Caleb might contribute to groceries, she'd get defensive about how hard it was for young people to find good jobs in this economy. The excuses were always reasonable. The underlying message was always the same. Your role is to provide, not to expect. And somehow I'd accepted that message, not consciously, but in practice. Every time I chose peace over confrontation, every time I paid for something instead of requiring responsibility, every time I cleaned up their messes instead of insisting they handle their own problems, I'd trained them to see me as a resource, not a person with boundaries. The pink paint wasn't rebellion against authority. It was the logical next step in a relationship where my feelings, my property, and my legacy had never been treated as worth protecting. Sitting in my dark kitchen at 3 a.m., I finally understood what my father had tried to teach me during those Saturday mornings in the garage. Respect isn't something you can negotiate or request. It's something you require, or it disappears. I'd spent 14 years being afraid to require anything from Lila because I was terrified she'd leave, but she'd never learned to respect someone she didn't fear losing, and now she'd painted my father's car pink because she knew I'd let her. The coffee had gone cold while I sat there, but my thinking had never been clearer. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger was what she expected, what she was prepared for. Anger would let her play the victim, make me the bad guy, turn this into another drama where she'd eventually wear me down and I'd apologize for overreacting. But I wasn't overreacting. If anything, I'd been underreacting for years. I poured out the coffee, rinsed the cup, and went back upstairs. But instead of returning to my bedroom, I went to my home office and turned on the computer. It was time to stop being the father Lila could use and become the consequence she'd never learned to expect. The sun was coming up when I finally opened the file cabinet in my home office and pulled out the folder labeled Ford Restoration Records. 23 years of documentation, purchase receipts, parts lists, photos of every stage of the process, insurance appraisals, and most importantly, the title with my name clearly listed as sole owner. I'd kept meticulous records, partly because Dad had taught me to document everything, but mostly because the restoration had been a journey worth preserving. Photos of the car when I'd first inherited it, primer gray, rust spots, torn seats, pictures of Dad and me working side by side, him pointing out details I'd missed, me learning patience from a man who'd rebuilt 3 engines in his lifetime. The after photos from last summer showed what we'd accomplished. Original Acapulco blue paint, chrome that reflected like mirrors, and interior restored to factory specifications. The insurance appraisal from 6 months ago valued it at $47,000, not because it was rare, but because it had been restored with obsessive attention to authenticity. Now it was worth maybe half that, if I was lucky. I spread the photos across my desk and felt something shift inside me. Not anger, I was past anger. Something colder and more useful. Clarity. For 14 years, I'd been operating from fear. Fear that Lila would leave if I set boundaries. Fear that I'd lose the only family I had left. Fear that requiring respect would make me the kind of harsh, demanding parent I'd promised myself I'd never become. But fear had made me weak, and weakness had made me useless. Not just to myself, to Lila. She'd never learned to respect boundaries because I'd never enforced any. She'd never developed personal responsibility because I'd always been there to absorb the consequences of her choices. I'd thought I was protecting her. Instead, I'd been crippling her. The realization should have been devastating. Instead, it was liberating. Because it meant I could change course, not gradually, not with warnings and negotiations and second chances, immediately. I opened my laptop and logged into my bank account. 14 years of financial records told a story I'd been avoiding. Automatic transfers to Lila's account totaling $1,147 per month. Tuition payments, insurance, phone bill, credit card payments for purchases I'd never seen, emergency loans that were never repaid, temporary help that had become permanent dependency. The total was staggering. Not just the money, though that was significant, but the pattern. Every time Lila had faced a natural consequence of her choices, I'd intervened. Bad grades? I'd hire a tutor instead of letting her fail. Maxed out credit cards? I'd pay them off instead of letting her deal with creditors. No job? I'd increase her allowance instead of letting her experience financial pressure. I'd been so focused on providing for her that I'd never required her to provide for herself. The Ford was just the latest example. She'd destroyed something irreplaceable because she'd never learned that some things aren't hers to touch. And she'd done it with my tools, in my garage, using my resources, because she'd never learned to distinguish between what was freely given and what belonged to someone else. I picked up my phone and started making calls. First, the bank. I scheduled an appointment for that afternoon to discuss account changes. The representative was helpful. Apparently, ending automatic transfers was simpler than setting them up had been. Next, my insurance agent. The Ford was still covered, but I needed to understand how the unauthorized paint job affected the policy. The conversation was enlightening, since I was the sole owner and the work had been done by someone living in my household with access to my garage. It would be treated as an owner modification, not vandalism. The coverage would continue, but the value would be reassessed based on current condition. Finally, I called the classic car dealership where I'd bought parts over the years. Jerry, the owner, knew the Ford well. He'd helped me source original components and had admired the finished restoration. When I explained the situation, his silence spoke volumes. "Pink, huh?" he finally said. That's tough, Brent. Really tough. What's it worth now?" Another pause. "Honestly, maybe 25, 30,000 if we can find the right buyer. Someone who wants the mechanical work but doesn't mind repainting. The problem is, that pink is going to need serious prep work to cover properly. We're talking full strip and prime, not just a color change." I thanked him and hung up. $25,000. Lila's moment of creative expression had cost me at least $20,000 in value, not counting the sentimental worth of the original paint job Dad and I had spent 3 summers perfecting. But the money wasn't the real issue. The real issue was what the pink paint represented: complete disregard for my feelings, my property, and my authority as the person who'd raised her. I spent the rest of the morning organizing documents, bank statements, loan records, insurance policies, utility bills, everything that showed the extent of Lila's financial dependence on me. Not because I planned to use them as weapons, but because I needed to see the full scope of what I'd been enabling. The picture was clear. Lila was 22 years old and had never supported herself for a single month. Not because she couldn't, she was intelligent, capable, and healthy, but because she'd never had to. I'd made it more comfortable for her to remain dependent than to become independent. That was ending today. Around noon, I heard movement downstairs. Lila and Caleb getting up, probably expecting me to have breakfast ready or at least coffee made. I stayed in my office and continued working. A few minutes later, Lila appeared in my doorway. "Dad, are you okay? You seem weird." "I'm fine, just catching up on some paperwork." She lingered, clearly expecting more conversation about the car. When I didn't provide it, she tried again. "So, about the Ford. I know it was kind of a surprise, but I really do think it looks better now. More modern, you know?" I looked up from my computer. "It's your mother's birthday next week." The non sequitur caught her off guard. "What?" "Yeah, I guess. Why?" "Just thinking about birthdays. Yours is coming up too." She brightened. 3 weeks? I've been thinking about what I want to do. Maybe that new restaurant downtown? The expensive one." "Maybe," I said and returned to my screen. She waited another moment, then left. I heard her and Caleb talking in the kitchen, probably wondering why I wasn't acting more upset about the car. Let them wonder. Confusion was better than the dramatic confrontation they were probably expecting. That afternoon, I drove the pink Ford to the bank and completed the account changes. All automatic transfers to Lila stopped immediately. All shared access to my credit cards ended. Her phone would be disconnected at the end of the current billing cycle unless she took over the payments herself. The bank officer, a woman about my age, was professionally discreet but clearly curious. "Will you be setting up any new automatic transfers, Mr. Braskin?" "No," I said. "No more automatic anything." From the bank, I drove to Jerry's dealership. He was waiting for me in the parking lot, and I watched his face as I pulled up. He tried to hide his reaction, but I could see the wince. "Jesus, Brent, I'm sorry, I really am." We spent an hour going over the car. Mechanically, it was still sound. The engine, transmission, and suspension were unaffected. But the paint job was even worse than I'd initially thought. Lila had used cheap hardware store spray paint over the original finish without any primer. It was already beginning to chip in places, and the color was uneven where she'd tried to apply multiple coats. "The good news," Jerry said, "is that your restoration work is still underneath all this. A professional strip and repaint would get you back to original condition. The bad news is that's going to cost $15,000 to $20,000, and there's always risk when you're stripping paint that old." I nodded. I'd already accepted that the original paint was gone forever. The question now was what to do next. "I might be interested in buying it," Jerry continued carefully. "Not for resale, for my own collection. I know what this car means to you, but if you're thinking about selling..." "How much?" $28,000. I know that's low compared to what it was worth, but I'd be buying it as a project car. I'd restore it properly, keep it original. It wouldn't be a flip. $28,000. $19,000 less than the insurance appraisal from 6 months ago. I need to think about it, I said, but I already knew what I was going to do. That evening, Lila and Caleb went out to dinner, using my credit card, which would work exactly one more time before being declined forever. I sat in my office and looked through the restoration photos again. Dad had been gone for 3 years, but I could still hear his voice. Some things are worth preserving, Brent, and some things are worth protecting from people who don't understand their value. The Ford had been worth preserving, but I'd failed to protect it from someone who saw it as nothing more than a canvas for her whims. I wouldn't make that mistake again. I picked up my phone and called Jerry. It's Brent. If the offer's still good, I'll take it. You sure about this? I'm sure. We arranged to meet the next morning to complete the paperwork. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet house and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace, not happiness. Selling the Ford felt like losing Dad all over again. But peace that comes from finally making a decision based on principle rather than fear. Lila had painted the car pink because she'd never learned that some things weren't hers to touch. Tomorrow, she'd learn that some consequences can't be negotiated away, and I'd learn whether I'd waited too long to start being the parent she'd needed all along. The next morning, I was already dressed and drinking coffee when Lila stumbled into the kitchen at 10:30. She looked surprised to see me. Usually I'd have left for work by now, but I'd cleared my schedule for the day. Morning, Dad. You're up early. Same time as always, I said. Coffee's fresh. She poured herself a cup and sat across from me at the table. So, are we going to talk about the elephant in the garage? What elephant? She laughed, the sound carrying a note of relief. The pink elephant, my artistic masterpiece. I know you were probably shocked at first, but now that you've had time to think about it... I've been thinking about your birthday, I said. Again, the subject change caught her off guard, but she recovered quickly. Lila had always been adaptable when the conversation moved in a direction she liked. Oh, yeah, 3 weeks. I was hoping we could do something special this year. I'm finally 23, like officially an adult. The irony was lost on her, but not on me. I was thinking dinner at Chez Laurent. Her eyes widened. Chez Laurent was the most expensive restaurant in town, the kind of place I'd taken her mother for our anniversary, back when we were still trying to save the marriage. Really? That place is, really expensive. Special birthdays deserve special celebrations. She was practically glowing now. That's amazing. Can Caleb come? Of course. This is so cool. I can't wait to tell him. She paused, studying my face. You're really not mad about the car? I met her eyes. I'm not mad. It was true. I wasn't mad anymore. What I felt was something much colder and more final than anger, but she didn't need to know that yet. I told you it wasn't that deep, she said, using the phrase that had crystallized everything for me 2 nights ago. You always worry too much about stuff. It's just a car. Just a car. The 1967 Mustang that my father had bought new, that we'd restored together over 2 decades, that represented every Saturday morning of my childhood and half the weekends of my adult life. Just a car. You're right, I said. It's just a car. Her smile was radiant. In her mind, she'd won. She'd pushed the boundary as far as it would go, faced no consequences, and gotten rewarded with an expensive birthday dinner. The pattern that had defined our relationship for 14 years was intact. Except it wasn't. Actually, I said, standing up, I have something for you, early birthday present. I went to my office and returned with a small wrapped box. Inside were the keys to her Honda Civic. The same keys she'd been using for 2 years, but now attached to a new keychain. I don't understand, she said, turning the keys over in her hands. The car is yours now, officially. I had the title transferred yesterday. This wasn't entirely true. The paperwork wouldn't be complete for another few days, but the process was already in motion. The Civic had been in my name for insurance purposes, but I'd always intended it as her car. Wow. Thanks, Dad. That's, actually really thoughtful. She seemed genuinely touched, which made what was coming next both easier and harder. There is one condition, I said. Her expression became cautious. What kind of condition? You'll need to take over the insurance payments and the maintenance. Oil changes, repairs, registration, all of it. It's your car now, so it's your responsibility. Oh. She looked less enthusiastic. How much is insurance? About $200 a month for someone your age, plus gas, maintenance, whatever else comes up. That's what car ownership costs. I could see her doing the math, realizing that owning a car was more expensive than she'd thought, but the keys were already in her hands, and the gift had been given in the spirit of generosity. She couldn't complain without seeming ungrateful. Okay, she said finally. I can handle that. I'm sure you can. What she didn't know What she couldn't know yet was that her ability to handle it was about to be tested in ways she'd never imagined. The automatic transfer that had been putting money in her account every month had ended yesterday. The credit cards that had been covering her expenses would be declined starting tomorrow. The safety net that had made her confident about taking on new expenses was already gone, but she'd figure that out soon enough. "I should go tell Caleb about dinner," she said, standing up with the keys clutched in her hand. "He's going to flip. He's never been anywhere that fancy. I'm sure he'll enjoy it." She headed toward the stairs, then turned back. "Dad, thanks for not being weird about the car thing, and for the birthday dinner, and for, everything." "You're welcome." She disappeared upstairs, and I heard her voice through the ceiling, excitedly telling Caleb about Chez Laurent and the car title. Their muffled conversation was animated, celebratory. They thought they had gotten away with something. I spent the rest of the day running errands, stopped by Jerry's dealership to finalize the paperwork for selling the Ford, visited my lawyer to update my will, not because I was planning to pass away, but because I wanted to ensure that my assets would be distributed according to my current feelings rather than old assumptions about family loyalty. When I got home that evening, Lila and Caleb were in the living room watching Netflix on the big screen TV I'd bought last year. They looked comfortable, settled, like they owned the place. "Hey, Dad," Lila called out without looking away from the screen. "What's for dinner?" It was a question she'd been asking since she was 8 years old. "What's for dinner, Dad?" "What are we having, Dad?" "Are you cooking tonight, Dad?" Always assuming that meals were my responsibility, that her job was to show up and eat whatever I'd prepared or purchased. "I'm not sure what you're having," I said. "I already ate." She turned around then, looking confused. "You already ate? Where?" "At that new place downtown, the one you mentioned wanting to try." "By yourself?" "By myself." She exchanged a glance with Caleb. "That's weird. You never eat out by yourself." "I'm trying new things." I went upstairs to my office and closed the door. Through the floor, I could hear them discussing this unexpected development. Lila's voice carried a note of concern now, not about my well-being, but about the disruption to her routine. For 22 years, I'd been predictable, available, reliable in ways that made her life easier and her choices consequence-free. Tonight was the first crack in that foundation, and she was smart enough to sense that something had shifted. But she wasn't smart enough to understand what. Tomorrow was her birthday dinner. Tomorrow, I'd sit across from her and Caleb at the most expensive restaurant in town and let them order whatever they wanted. I'd smile and make conversation and pick up the check, just like I had hundreds of times before. And then I'd go home and finish what I'd started. The last gift I'd ever give Lila was the opportunity to learn what independence actually costs. She'd painted my father's car pink because she'd never learned that actions have consequences. She was about to get the education I should have given her years ago. Chez Laurent was exactly as pretentious as I remembered. White tablecloths so crisp they looked starched into submission, servers who introduced themselves by first name and recited the evening's specials like Shakespearean soliloquies, wine prices that could fund a small vacation to somewhere warm. The lighting was dim enough to be romantic, but bright enough that you could see exactly what you were paying for. Lila and Caleb were trying to act sophisticated, but their eyes kept widening at the menu prices, darting between the gold-embossed lettering and each other's faces. "The lobster is market price," Lila whispered to me, leaning across the table like she was sharing state secrets. "What does that mean?" "It means expensive," I said, not looking up from my own menu. "Order whatever you want." She did. They both did. Appetizers that came arranged like small sculptures on oversized plates. Entrees with names in French that the server had to translate. Dessert that involved tableside preparation and a small torch. A bottle of wine that cost more than most people spend on groceries in a week. I watched the sommelier pour it with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious ceremonies. Caleb kept taking pictures of the food with his phone, angling each shot carefully, clearly planning to document this experience for social media. The flash reflected off the silverware, off the crystal glasses, off the polished surfaces of everything in this place that existed to remind people like him that they didn't belong here. "This is incredible, Mr. Braskin," he said, cutting into his $40 steak with the provided steak knife. The meat was so tender it barely required pressure. "I can't believe places like this exist. Like people actually eat here regularly?" "Some people do," I said. "Special occasions call for special treatment." Lila was glowing. Her face flushed from the wine and the attention and the sheer novelty of being treated like someone important. "This is definitely the best birthday ever. Even better than when you took me to Disney World for my 16th. I remembered that trip with perfect clarity. 3 days in Florida, first-class flights both ways, the best hotel on property with a view of the castle, meals at every character restaurant she wanted to try. I'd spent nearly $8,000 making sure she had the perfect Sweet 16 experience, watching her smile in every photo while I worried about the credit card balance. At the time, I'd thought I was creating memories, building a relationship, showing her that she mattered to me. Now I realized I'd been training her to expect that love was measured in dollars spent, that affection came with a price tag, that the depth of my care could be calculated by the size of the check I was willing to sign. "I have something for you," I said, pulling out a small wrapped box from my jacket pocket. The wrapping paper was simple, elegant, no cartoon characters or bright colors, adult paper for what should have been an adult moment. "Another present?" She tore off the wrapping paper with the enthusiasm of someone who'd never learned to consider the cost of generosity, never paused to think about what went into each gift beyond the immediate gratification of receiving it. Inside was a simple silver bracelet, not expensive by the standards of this restaurant, but elegant, timeless, the kind of jewelry a young woman should own, something she could wear for years without it looking dated or cheap. "It's beautiful," she said, fastening it around her wrist with Caleb's help. Her fingers fumbled with the clasp, and I noticed her nails were freshly manicured. Another expense I'd probably paid for without knowing. "Thank you, Dad." "There's an inscription," I said, watching her face. She turned the bracelet slowly, searching until she found the engraving on the inside. "Every ending is a new beginning." "That's cryptic," she said, laughing in that way she had when she was nervous but trying to hide it. "What does it mean?" "You'll figure it out." The server brought the check on a small leather folder, placing it discreetly beside my plate. $347 for one meal. I paid without comment, without hesitation, left a generous tip because the service had been impeccable, even if the company had been complicated. I signed the receipt with the same pen I'd used 3 years earlier for my father's official paperwork, a cross pen he'd given me for my 30th birthday. We walked to the parking lot together, the night air cool after the warmth of the restaurant. The parking lot was half empty now, the dinner rush over, just a few expensive cars scattered across the premium spaces near the entrance. "This was amazing," Lila said, hugging me goodbye. Her arms felt thin around my shoulders, and I wondered when she'd gotten so fragile, or if she'd always been this way, and I'd just never noticed. "Seriously, thank you, for everything." "You're welcome." They drove away in her Honda now, with all the responsibilities that entailed, and I watched their taillights disappear into the stream of traffic on the main road. The sound of their engine faded, replaced by the ambient noise of the city, distant sirens, the hum of the highway, someone's car alarm going off 3 rows over. I walked the 6 blocks home instead of driving. The pink Ford was still sitting in my garage, a monument to my failures as a parent, but I couldn't bear to sit in it tonight. The walk gave me time to think, to process, to prepare for what came next. The sidewalks were mostly empty at this hour, just a few other people heading home from dinner or work, everyone moving through their own private dramas. Back home, I went directly to my office without turning on any other lights in the house. The darkness felt appropriate somehow. I opened my laptop and logged into the bank's website, the familiar login screen glowing blue in the dark room. The automatic transfers had stopped as scheduled. Lila's account, which had received $1,847 every month for the past 4 years. I did the math quickly, over $88,000 total, would receive nothing this month, or next month, or ever again. I pulled up her credit card statements, the ones I'd been paying automatically for 3 years without really looking at the charges. The balances weren't huge by some standards, but they weren't small either. Gas stations I didn't recognize, restaurants I'd never been to, clothes from stores that catered to people half my age, subscriptions to streaming services and apps I'd never heard of, recurring charges that added up month after month because no one was watching, no one was saying no. The monthly minimums totaled about $600. Combined with her car insurance, her phone bill, her health insurance, all of it had been transferred to her name yesterday with payment due immediately. She'd get the notices in the next few days, probably assume they were billing errors at first. Computer glitches, mistakes that would be corrected once she called customer service. By the time she realized they weren't errors, she'd be facing about $3,000 in monthly expenses she'd never had to think about before. $3,000 that had simply appeared in her life, paid by someone else, invisible except in the lifestyle it enabled. I opened the folder of restoration photos one more time, even though I'd looked at them a dozen times in the past few days. 23 years of documentation, from the day Dad first brought the car home, me at 6 years old, standing beside it in the driveway, barely tall enough to see over the hood, to the last photo I'd taken before leaving for Denver. The transformation was remarkable, not just of the car, but of me. In the early photos, I was a young man learning patience and precision from his father, absorbing lessons that went far deeper than just how to restore a vehicle. In the later ones, after Dad was gone, I was the teacher, showing Lila how to properly clean chrome without scratching it, how to check fluid levels, how to respect something that had been built to last, how to treat objects and people with the care they deserved. She'd been interested then, maybe not passionate like I was, but respectful, curious, willing to learn. She'd asked questions about why we used specific products, why we didn't rush, why we documented everything. She'd seemed to understand that this wasn't just about a car. It was about preserving something meaningful, about honoring the past while caring for the present. When had that changed? When had she stopped seeing the Ford as something special and started seeing it as just another thing in her environment that existed for her convenience? Another resource to be used, another possession to be modified according to her whims? The answer was uncomfortable but clear, when I'd stopped requiring her to earn access to the things that mattered to me, when I'd made everything available, everything negotiable, everything subject to her comfort rather than my boundaries. I'd given her everything freely: money, support, access, forgiveness, endless second chances, and she'd learned to take everything freely. The Ford was just the latest casualty of my failure to teach her that some things must be earned, some things must be respected, and some things must never be touched without permission. But that lesson could still be taught. It was later than it should have been, years too late if I was being honest, but not too late. Not yet. I closed the laptop and sat in the darkness of my office, listening to the house settle around me, the refrigerator humming downstairs, the heater clicking on and off, the sound of my own breathing in the quiet space. For the first time in 3 days, I felt something close to peace. Not happiness. Selling the Ford would feel like losing Dad all over again, like severing one of the last physical connections I had to him. But the peace that comes from finally making a decision based on principle rather than fear. Sleep came easier that night than it had in weeks. The next morning, Jerry called at exactly 9 o'clock, punctual as always. "You sure about this, Brent? I know what this car means to you. I know what it meant to your father." "I'm sure." "And you understand that once we complete the sale, that's it? I mean, I'd probably sell it back to you someday if you wanted, but the market value is going to change once I do the restoration work. It won't be the same transaction." "I won't want it back, Jerry. That car, it's not mine anymore. Not really. Not after what happened to it." There was silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that meant he understood more than I was saying. "Okay then. See you at 2?" "See you at 2. I spent the morning cleaning out the Ford one final time. 23 years of accumulated memories packed into every corner of that vehicle. The original owner's manual Dad had saved, wrapped in plastic to protect it from oil and dirt, with his notes in the margins about maintenance schedules. A pair of his work gloves I'd kept in the glove compartment, worn leather that still smelled faintly of the motor oil he'd used. Photos of various stages of the restoration tucked behind the sun visor. Me at 12, 16, 20, 30, standing beside the car in different stages of completion, Dad's arm around my shoulders in most of them. In the trunk, underneath the spare tire, I found something I'd completely forgotten. A small notebook where Dad had recorded every modification, every repair, every improvement we'd made over the years. His handwriting, careful and precise, documenting our shared obsession with getting every detail right. I sat in the driveway and read through it, page by page, his voice echoing in my head with each entry. June 15th, 1987. Brent helped sand the primer today. He's getting better at keeping the pressure even. Patience is hard at his age, but he's learning. He'll understand someday why we don't rush. September 3rd, 1994. Finished the interior restoration. Brent did most of the work himself this time. I just supervised and handed him tools. I'm proud of what he's accomplished. More importantly, I'm proud of how he's learned to see a project through to completion. May 22nd, 2003. Brent's getting married next month. He says he wants to drive the Ford to his honeymoon. I told him that's what it's for. The important moments. The times you want to remember. That's when you bring out something special. I'd forgotten about that. Driving the Ford to our honeymoon, Irene laughing as we pulled away from the reception with tin cans tied to the bumper and "Just Married" written across the rear window in white shoe polish. Back when I'd thought we were building something that would last, when the future seemed clear and straightforward and full of promise. The final entry was from just a few months before Dad passed, his handwriting shakier but still readable. Brent knows this car better than I do now. He's surpassed me in patience, in attention to detail, in understanding what makes something worth preserving. He'll take good care of it when I'm gone. Some things are worth preserving, some lessons are worth the time it takes to teach them. Some things are worth preserving, but some things matter more than the objects themselves. What was worth preserving wasn't the car. It was the principle that had built it. The idea that some things matter enough to protect, that respect isn't optional, that love without boundaries becomes enabling, that teaching someone accountability is more important than keeping them comfortable. I'd failed to preserve those principles when it came to raising Lila, but I could still preserve them going forward. I could still teach her, even if the lessons came harder and later than they should have. At 2 o'clock, I drove the pink Ford to Jerry's dealership for the last time. The drive took 12 minutes, and I spent every second of it remembering other drives, teaching Lila to drive in this car when she was 15, her hands gripping the wheel too tightly, Dad's voice in my head reminding me to be patient, taking it to car shows, watching other enthusiasts admire the restoration work, feeling proud of what we'd accomplished, driving it to Dad's funeral, the only vehicle that felt appropriate for that particular journey. The paperwork took 20 minutes. Jerry had everything prepared, professional and efficient, despite the personal nature of the transaction. The check was already written, $28,000, exactly as promised. Not what the car was worth before Lila destroyed it, but fair given its current condition. "I'll take good care of it," Jerry said as I signed the title transfer, my signature looking shakier than I expected. "I'll strip that pink paint properly, do it right. It'll be beautiful again, the way you and your father intended." "I know you will. That's why I'm selling it to you instead of someone else." "Can I ask you something?" Jerry set down his pen, looking at me with the kind of directness that comes from 30 years of knowing someone. "Why not just have it repainted yourself? Why sell it? I know the money's fair, but this is about more than money." I considered how to answer that. Because keeping it would mean pretending what happened didn't matter. It would mean accepting that some things can be fixed with money and time, that consequences can be erased if you're willing to pay enough. I need her to understand that some things, once broken, can't be put back together. Jerry nodded slowly. "That's a hard lesson." "It's a necessary one. One I should have taught her years ago." I walked home, leaving the Ford in Jerry's lot for the last time. The 6 blocks gave me time to think about what came next, to prepare myself for the conversations that were coming, the accusations, the anger, the desperate bargaining. Lila would figure out the financial situation within a week, maybe sooner if she tried to use one of the credit cards. She'd be confused at first, certain there was some mistake, some technical error in the banking system. Then angry, furious that I'd done this without warning, without discussion, without giving her a chance to prepare. Then desperate when she realized I wasn't going to back down, wasn't going to negotiate, wasn't going to be convinced by tears or guilt or threats. She'd demand explanations, make accusations, probably threaten to cut me out of her life entirely, as if that threat still held the power it once had. I'd listen to all of it calmly, and then I'd explain that she was 23 years old, healthy and intelligent, and perfectly capable of supporting herself if she chose to. The key phrase being, if she chose to. For 14 years, I'd made it easier for her to remain dependent than to become independent. That was ending now, not with anger or punishment or vindictiveness, but with a simple withdrawal of unearned support. The consequences she'd never had to face were finally arriving, delivered not in fury, but in calm, measured boundaries. She could get a job. Any job. McDonald's or Starbucks or Target, or any of the dozens of places that were always hiring. She could move in with Caleb and split expenses, learn what it felt like to depend on someone who couldn't afford to support her completely. She could learn to budget, to prioritize, to make the hard choices that separate children from adults. Or she could continue to act entitled, continue to believe that the world owed her comfort and convenience, and face the natural consequences of that choice without me intervening to save her. Either way, she'd finally learn what I should have taught her years ago, that respect isn't negotiable, that actions have consequences, that boundaries aren't suggestions, and that love doesn't mean accepting unacceptable behavior. My phone started ringing at 8:23 a.m. on Thursday morning, exactly 6 days after Lila's birthday dinner. I was in my office, reviewing client files and drinking my second cup of coffee, when her name appeared on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, listening to the phone buzz against the desk. She called back immediately, then again, then twice more in rapid succession, the kind of calling pattern that spoke of genuine panic rather than casual need. On the 4th call, I answered. "Dad, something's wrong with my bank account." Her voice carried the particular strain of someone who'd spent the morning dealing with automated customer service systems and getting nowhere. "The money didn't transfer this month, and when I called the bank, they said the automatic deposit was canceled. But that doesn't make sense, right? You wouldn't cancel it without telling me. There must be some kind of error. I canceled it last week. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. I could hear her breathing, could almost hear her brain trying to process what I just said, trying to find an explanation that made sense with her understanding of our relationship. What do you mean? You canceled it? I mean, I stopped the automatic transfers to your account. All of them, permanently. Why? The word came out sharper than she'd intended, and I could hear her trying to recalibrate, to find the tone that usually worked on me, the one that had worked for years. I mean, is everything okay? Are you having money problems? Is work slow? Because if you need to reduce the amount, we can talk about that. I can make adjustments. I'm fine. Work is fine. I'm not having money problems. Then why? She stopped herself, and I could practically hear her thinking, trying to understand what was happening. Dad, I need that money. I have bills. The car insurance alone is like $200, and that's just one thing. I have credit cards. I have my phone. I know. You mentioned the insurance when I gave you the car. But I can't afford $200. I don't have a job. I don't have any income. How am I supposed to pay for insurance? That sounds like a problem you should solve. Another silence, longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice was different, harder, the confusion giving way to something closer to anger. What is this about? Are you punishing me for something? Is this about the car? Because if you're mad about the paint, just say so. We can talk about it. I can get it repainted. I can fix it. I'm not punishing you for anything. I'm just not paying your bills anymore. Since when? Since now. I could hear her breathing, rapid and shallow. Could imagine her standing in the kitchen where we'd eaten breakfast together for 14 years, her hand gripping the phone too tightly, trying to understand how her world had just shifted beneath her feet. Dad, this isn't funny. I'm serious. I have actual bills. My credit card payment is due tomorrow, and I don't have the money. My phone bill is due next week. The car insurance is due in 3 days. I can't just... Then you should probably get a job. A job? She said it like I'd suggested she take up lion taming or deep-sea welding. I can't just get a job. I don't have experience. I don't have references. I don't even have interview clothes anymore. Everything I own is too casual or too old. I'd need money to buy. You have a college degree and 3 years of retail experience from high school. That was years ago, and I only worked there for like 6 months before you said I should focus on school. No one's going to hire me based on 6 months of retail experience from 5 years ago. Then you should probably start with entry-level positions and work your way up. That's what most people do. Dad, stop. This is crazy. You can't just cut me off like this. I'm your daughter. You chose to raise me. You chose to take responsibility for me when my mom left. You don't get to just change your mind now because you're mad about a car. There it was. The card she'd been building up to. The reminder of our relationship, the guilt she expected would make me back down like I always had before. The invocation of choice and responsibility and obligation that had kept me trapped in this pattern for 14 years. You're 23 years old, I said, keeping my voice level. You're healthy, intelligent, and capable. You don't need me to pay your bills. But I don't have any money. How am I supposed to live? The same way everyone else does. You work for it. How? Where? Doing what? That's for you to figure out. Dad, please, I'm scared. I don't know how to do this. I've never had to... Her voice cracked, and I could hear her starting to cry. The tears that had worked on me countless times before, that had short-circuited every attempt at discipline, every boundary I'd tried to establish. But tears didn't change reality. They didn't make her 23 years younger or erase 14 years of learned helplessness. They didn't undo the pink paint on my father's car or restore the respect she'd never learned to give. Being scared is normal, I said. It means you're taking the situation seriously. Can't we talk about this? Work something out? I promise I'll get a job, but I need time to find something good. Something that pays enough. And I need money to live on while I'm looking. Just a few more months, and then I'll... No. No? No, we can't work something out. No, you don't get transition time. No, I won't give you money to live on while you look for work. You're an adult, Lila. Adults don't get allowances. They don't get grace periods. They pay their own bills, or they face the consequences. I could hear Caleb's voice in the background, asking what was wrong, what was happening. Lila covered the phone, but I could still make out her muffled explanation. He cut me off. He's not giving me money anymore. He's serious. Caleb's response was predictable, his voice rising. What? Why? That's messed up, man. That's really messed up. Lila came back on the line, her voice steadier now, backed by Caleb's presence. Dad, Caleb says... I don't care what Caleb says. This conversation is between you and me. But he thinks you're being unreasonable. He thinks you're overreacting too. Caleb is 24 years old and works part-time at a vape shop. His opinion about financial responsibility isn't particularly valuable to me. That's mean. That's a really mean thing to say. It's accurate. And frankly, if Caleb had spent less time enabling your entitlement and more time encouraging you to develop some independence, we might not be having this conversation. She was crying harder now, the kind of sobbing that used to bring me running, that used to make me promise anything to make it stop. I don't know what to do. Please, Dad. Please don't do this. Start with getting a job. Any job? Today? Today? I can't get a job today. I need to make a resume. McDonald's is hiring. So is Target. So is every restaurant and retail store in town. Most of them will hire you on the spot if you walk in and ask. You can have a job by this afternoon if you actually want one. But those are just basic jobs, minimum wage jobs. Most jobs are basic jobs, Lila. That's why they're called jobs instead of careers, and minimum wage is better than no wage. I can't work at McDonald's. I have a college degree. Then use it. But either way, this conversation is over. You're an adult. Act like one. Dad, wait. I hung up before she could continue. The phone rang again immediately, but I turned it off and set it face down on my desk. The silence that followed was profound, almost physical in its weight. For 3 hours, I focused on work. Real work. With clients who paid me for expertise they couldn't get elsewhere, who respected my time and my knowledge and my boundaries. It felt good to be useful in a way that was earned rather than expected, to be valued for what I provided rather than simply for existing. At noon, I drove to Jerry's dealership to pick up some final paperwork I'd forgotten the day before. The Ford was in the back lot, looking naked and vulnerable without the pink paint that had covered it for less than a week. Jerry had already started the restoration work. Want to see the progress? Jerry asked, gesturing toward the car. We walked over together. The hood and front fenders had been stripped completely, revealing bare metal underneath. In some places, I could still see traces of the original Acapulco blue, ghosts of what the car had been before Lila decided it needed to be something else. It's going to be gorgeous when it's done, Jerry said, running his hand along the stripped fender. Might take me a year, working on it between other projects, but it'll be worth it. I'm going to do it right, the way you and your father would have wanted. I know you will. You sure you don't want to be involved? I mean, I know you sold it to me, but if you wanted to help with the restoration, keep that connection to your father. I considered it. There was something appealing about the idea of working on the Ford again, bringing it back to the way Dad and I had originally envisioned it, restoring what had been destroyed. But that would be going backward, and I was finally moving forward. Finally making the hard choices I should have made years ago. Thanks, Jerry, but no, it's your project now, your car. I need to let it go. He nodded, understanding in the way that only another father could understand. If you change your mind, I won't, but I appreciate the offer. The drive home took longer than usual. I found myself taking side streets, avoiding the main roads, not ready to return to the house where Lila and Caleb were probably still processing what had happened, still trying to figure out if I was serious, still hoping this was some kind of temporary insanity that would pass if they just waited it out. When I finally pulled into the driveway, both their cars were gone. A note was taped to the front door, Lila's handwriting rushed and angry. We're staying at Caleb's. Don't call me. I crumpled the note and went inside. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been for months, empty of their presence, their noise, their assumption that everything here existed for their benefit. I walked through the rooms slowly, seeing them with fresh eyes. The living room where they'd spent countless hours watching TV on my subscription services, eating food I'd bought, using electricity I'd paid for. The kitchen where Lila had stood this morning, crying into the phone, demanding that I continue providing for her while she figured things out. The garage where my father's car had been violated, treated as nothing more than a canvas for her momentary whim. In my office, I opened the file cabinet and pulled out one more document I'd prepared but hadn't yet needed. A formal letter, typed and printed on my business letterhead, outlining the terms of Lila's continued residence in my house. She could stay, the letter explained, under the following conditions. She would pay $800 per month in rent, due on the 1st of each month. She would maintain employment and provide proof of income. She would contribute to household expenses, groceries, utilities, cleaning supplies. She would respect my property and my privacy. Any violation of these terms would result in immediate eviction, processed through legal channels with no exceptions or negotiations. The letter was fair, reasonable, far more generous than most landlords would be. But it was also final, non-negotiable. The end of free housing, free support, free access to everything I'd built. I placed the letter in an envelope and left it on the kitchen table where she'd see it when she came back for her things. If she came back. Part of me suspected she wouldn't, that she'd find some other safety net, some other person willing to catch her before she had to learn to stand on her own. But that was her choice to make. My phone buzzed with incoming messages. I'd turned it back on out of habit. 7 texts from Lila, each one more desperate than the last. 3 voicemails I didn't listen to. 2 messages from Irene, Lila's mother, who somehow had heard about the situation and wanted to talk about what was best for Lila. I deleted them all without reading or listening to them. What was best for Lila was learning to be responsible for herself. What was best for Lila was understanding that actions have consequences, that respect must be earned, that love without boundaries is just enabling in disguise. What was best for Lila was having a father who cared more about her character than her comfort. I'd failed at that for 14 years. I wasn't failing anymore. That evening, I sat in the living room with a glass of whiskey, the expensive bottle I'd been saving for a special occasion, and thought about my father, about the lessons he'd tried to teach me, about the values he'd demonstrated through action rather than words. Patience, precision, respect for things that mattered, the understanding that some things are worth preserving and some things are worth protecting, even when protection requires difficult choices. I'd preserved the Ford for 23 years. I'd protected it from weather and wear and the simple passage of time. But I'd failed to protect it from someone who lived in my own house, who used my own tools, who should have learned from me what it meant to respect something precious. That failure was mine. But the lesson could still be taught. Somewhere across town, Lila was learning what it felt like to face consequences without a safety net. To understand that money doesn't appear automatically, that bills must be paid, that independence requires more than just wanting it, it requires earning it. The lesson would be hard, harder than it needed to be because I'd waited so long to teach it. But hard lessons are often the most valuable ones. My father had taught me that 23 years ago, in a garage that smelled of motor oil and possibility. He'd taught me that some things are worth the effort, worth the patience, worth the years of careful attention. Now I was teaching his granddaughter, not by birth, but by choice, that same lesson in a different form. Some things are worth preserving, and some lessons are worth more than the things we sacrifice to teach them. I finished the whiskey and went to bed. For the first time in 2 weeks, I slept without dreaming.